Well, in October, I was in Arkansas for some continuing education, and we got an afternoon off. And so a couple of classmates and I decided it's fall, it's beautiful here, it's kind of crisp weather, let's go for a hike. In fact, I think, Jim, we have a picture of what that hike looked like, so let's just go ahead and leave it on this one for a second, because we went and decided let's hike up. Because we think that if we go up this big hill, we'll eventually get to a ridge, and on that ridge, I think there will be a pretty good view from up there. And so it's one of those where it got pretty steep at parts, and even though it's cold outside, I'm still breaking a sweat and huffing and puffing. It was that sort of hike when you have elevation in it. But it was enjoyable because you had all these fall colors. You were stomping on leaves the whole time, and you're kind of going, this feels good. It feels good to be outside and in nature for a second. Well, eventually, we got up to the ridge, and it was exactly what we were hoping for. You could see the camp down below. You could see all the tree-covered hills around you, and it felt like this was worth working for. But we also noticed there was a sign up there. In fact, there were a series of signs up there, and that was pretty fascinating. We thought, why, this seemed like a pretty rural hike, kind of away from camp, so what are all these signs doing up on the ridge? And so we hiked over to the first one, because my curiosity was really piqued right now to say, well, what is this? What is this sign? And I'll go ahead and show you what the first sign said. It said, Black Walnut, and showed a tree. And then I realized, we're on a tree tour. In fact, all of these trees up on this ridge had their own signs. And so we went and we were looking at them, and the humorous part of it to us was all the trees looked the same. Really, it was very hard to tell any difference, discernible difference in these trees, but they all had their own little handmade signs that you could tell someone went to a lot of work to go and put on this trail. Well, so we're kind of laughing about the signs, but then all of a sudden we get to one that stopped us in our tracks because there was something different about it, something that seemed like it was missing. And so I took a picture of that one too. Let's see if you can figure out what is wrong with the American cedar. Someone cut the tree down. We're on this tree tour. They made signs for all these trees, and then someone went and cut down the American cedar at some point. We were laughing about it, thinking, okay, if you knew you were going to cut that tree down, why leave the sign up? Why would you not take that with you? But instead, here we go. We've got American cedar, and then it just cut right there at the roots. It kind of made me wonder, as I was looking at this week, have you ever had a day or a week where you kind of feel like that tree? We're just kind of cut off at the knees, where you go, this week did not go like I planned or like I thought it would. I can empathize with that picture sometimes. And in fact, it made me think, we're going through this series on decision making. It's a series you voted for, and it'll end next week, but it's all about big decisions in life. And how can God help interpret and interact with the decisions we make? But it made me think about studying a particular aspect of decision making, particularly when decisions are made for you. I mean, we like to think that we're always in charge, that we are masters of our own destiny, that what I say goes, but sometimes life happens to you, kind of like it happened to this tree. And it's out of your control, and it's just happening, and the decision is less about what you are going to decide and more about, well, how do I respond to what just happened in my life? I'll give you some examples. Maybe you can relate to these. Maybe you're saying, well, I didn't choose to be transferred, but my company did, and so now I need to go and get to know a new city. Or I didn't choose to have this illness, but now I have to cope with it and maybe make some life changes in response to this illness that I'm now dealing with. Or I didn't expect to have that fourth child, but here we go. Okay, life is happening, and I have to respond to it. We don't always make the decisions in our lives, but we do have a choice of how to respond once those decisions are made. And so I want to study a story in the Bible, and it's about a woman who did not have much say in what happened to her in her life. And I want to study in particular, how does God interact with her? How does God interact with this woman? Her name is Hagar, and we find her story in the book of Genesis. let me give you a little bit of background on Hagar. Hagar was a slave, and she lived in the household of Abraham and Sarah. At one point, God comes to Sarah and says, you are going to have a child. You're going to give birth to a son. And Sarah is overjoyed because she is pretty elderly at this point and has not been able to have children her entire life long. And so God comes to her and says, you're going to give birth to a child. And she's excited, and she's looking at the future, and she's excited about what God has said is going to happen, but she's also skeptical, saying, is this really possible? Can God really do this through me? Well, she sits in that kind of excitement and skepticism, and then nothing happens for years. And she waits, and she waits, and she waits, and she is still not pregnant. And I would guess at some point the doubt crept into her a little bit. And maybe the doubt in God's promises really overtook the faith that she had in God when God first made the promise. And so after years of waiting, she finally takes things into her own hands, which is when Hagar enters the story. Hagar is a slave, a servant, just in this household back in Genesis, so thousands and thousands of years ago. And so Sarah goes to Abraham, I want you to go with Hagar. I want you to sleep with her and produce an heir in that way. You see, she did not want to wait for God's timing. She got to a point in her own life where she said, all right, God, you're slow. It's not happening how fast I would want it to happen. I've been waiting for years here, so I'm going to take this own initiative in this decision making and make it happen for you. And at least initially, it seems like they actually found success because Hagar gave birth to a son, and they named him Ishmael. But Ishmael was never the promised son that God had promised Sarah. And so years go by once again, and Sarah then becomes pregnant. And then Sarah gives birth. And what should be a really time of celebration now has a little bit of challenge and a little bit of awkwardness to it because Sarah and Abraham did not wait for God, but took things into their own hands and initiative years and years earlier. And so our scripture begins with Sarah finally giving birth to the promised child. It begins in this way. The Lord kept his word and did for Sarah exactly what he had promised. She became pregnant, and she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. This happened at just the time God said it would. And Abraham named their son Isaac. 8 days after Isaac was born, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. And Sarah declared, God has brought me laughter, and all who hear about this will laugh with me. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse a baby? Yet I have given Abraham a son in his old age. And when Isaac grew up and was about to be weaned, Abraham prepared a huge feast to celebrate the occasion. And this sounds like a time of celebration, doesn't it? I mean, this is a time when God has been faithful. After years, God has finally answered their prayers, and look, there's a son, Isaac. And yet, in this sense of, or in this time of celebration, Sarah still looks back to her past. She looks past to a time when she did not wait for God, and maybe she and Abraham were not faithful in that time of waiting. And so in this time of celebration, in verse 9, we're told, but Sarah saw Ishmael. Interesting, isn't it? How those two verses are juxtaposed with one another. Where Abraham goes, we're throwing a party. And then Sarah sees Ishmael, a reminder of her past, a reminder of when she wasn't faithful to God. In this moment, I would hope that Sarah and Abraham would go to Hagar and Ishmael and say, listen, we know that the promised son has come, but you're still family too. And so we want your grace, we want your forgiveness, and we want to live kind of with you in all of this. That's what I would hope would have happened if I was maybe in their place. But human nature takes over instead. And so instead, we're told that Sarah saw Ishmael, the son of Abraham, and her Egyptian servant Hagar, making fun of her son Isaac. And so she turned to Abraham and demanded, get rid of that slave woman and her son. He is not going to share the inheritance with my son, Isaac. I won't have it. The story takes a turn, doesn't it? A really sad, tragic turn in this moment, where Sarah cannot even refer to them by name, just says, get rid of that slave girl and her son. It's not get rid of Hagar and Ishmael, the people who have been in my household for years, the people that I know really, really well. No, it's get rid of that slave girl and her son. I can't bear to even see them in this moment. It's unfortunate, but Sarah and Abraham are trying to erase their past mistakes, and it doesn't matter who gets in the way of that erasing. Well, Abraham is upset by this, and we're told in verse 11, this upset Abraham very much, because Ishmael was his son. But God told Abraham, do not be upset over the boy and your servant. Do whatever Sarah tells you, for Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. But I will also make a nation of descendants of Hagar's son, because he is your son too. Basically, God speaks into the family chaos and says, okay, Abraham, this is not right, but go do what Sarah wants you to do. But know that I've not given up on Hagar. I've not given up on Ishmael. That I'm going to be with them too. So yeah, follow through with this plan, but know that I'm going to be present here as well. And so in verse 14, so Abraham got up early the next morning, prepared food and a container of water, and strapped them on Hagar's shoulders. Then he sent her away with their son, and she wandered aimlessly in the wilderness of Beersheba. Well, as we stated in the beginning, some decisions are made for you. And Hagar and Ishmael did not have a voice in any of this decision making. I bet they felt like life was just happening to them. Like they did not have a choice or control of their own destiny. That instead, the decisions of other people profoundly affected them, and they then just had to go along with those decisions. All of a sudden, a single mom and her son are wandering aimlessly in the wilderness. And I bet at some point Hagar looked up and thought, how did this happen? How did I end up here? Who is responsible for making this happen to me? I wonder, how does it feel when you have no voice in the decision-making process? You know, I bet none of us in this room can identify quite with what happened in that story. But surely there are times where we get a sense of it, where we go, yeah, that didn't go like I wanted it to. Or because of someone else's choice, I now have to deal with this newfound problem. Maybe not as extreme or severe of what Hagar and Ishmael had to deal with, but on some level, some gut level, we know when this happens to us, and it feels like it's not right. Well, the story goes from bad to worse. In verse 15, when the water was gone, she put the boy in the shade of a bush, and then she went and sat down by herself, about 100 yards away. I don't want to watch the boy die, she said, as she burst into tears. This had to have been the lowest moment of Hagar's life. This had to have been the point where she thinks, I'm going to watch my son die. She thinks she's reached the end of the line. She's in that moment where her outlook is as dim as it has ever been. And at the lowest of the low, we have verse 17. But God heard the boy crying. How interesting is that? I mean, one moment, Hagar sees no way out. The food is gone. The water is gone. They've been wandering aimlessly in the desert, and they don't know where to go. And she's at the point where she sends her son and says, I can't watch what's about to happen. So just go sit in the shade here. Maybe you'll have a little bit of comfort at the end of your life. And then she goes and she watches her son crying. She's crying. She feels defeated, like life has just done this to her and dealt her the worst hand. And in that moment of despair, we're told in the scriptures, but God heard the boy crying. In fact, in the next verse, but God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, Hagar, what's wrong? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Go to him and comfort him, for I will make him a great nation from his descendants. Then God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well full of water, and she quickly filled her water container and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy as he grew up in the wilderness. That's the end of the story. And it's a wild story that we find in the first book of our Bible. And I think there's a couple of things we can learn about this story, and particularly how when decisions are made for us and we have no voice in those decisions, how God can still be present. And so here is one of the things that we can learn. Ishmael still ended up in the wilderness, didn't he? God did not reverse the bad decisions that happened to Ishmael and Hagar. I mean, I would hope at some point that Sarah and Abraham would realize what they had done and went and found them and brought them back and said, no, this is your home, come and live with us. But that didn't happen, did it? No, they end the story in the wilderness. They're still in the wilderness when this story ends. The wrongs that happened to them are not suddenly righted. But what's different at the end of the story? The difference is that the despair is gone. And the despair is gone simply and only because God is suddenly present with them. I mean, the lowest moment of their life, they think they're alone. They're alone in the wilderness and they have nowhere to turn. And then all of a sudden, their outlook is changed, their future is bright, and the only thing that's different is they realize that God is present, that God is with them in the wilderness. And so one of the things we learn from this story is that when decisions happen to us, and we know that they are not good decisions, God doesn't automatically swoop in and change them and make them right. But in that time, God is still present. And sometimes feeling that presence is enough. Knowing that God is with you, even when life is happening to you, sometimes that is enough. So that's one of the things that I think we can learn from this. But the other is this. When life happens to us, and when we have situations that are not ideal and that we would consider very challenging, we still have a decision to make. Now, it's kind of counterintuitive, because if a decision happens to us and we feel like we don't have a voice, then you might say, well, what decision do I possibly have to make in this? But the decision to make is, how am I going to respond to life? Even if life is cruel and unexpected, how will I respond to what has just happened? I mean, think of how Hagar could have responded. She could have blamed Sarah and Abraham for the situation that she was put in. She could have been angry at her circumstances. She could have felt just defeated because life had happened to her. And for all we know, she felt all of these things. But what the story pushes us towards is a resolution of understanding that when bad things still happen to you, you can respond and say, well, how is God changing me in this? I mean, maybe the question should be less of, God, why did this happen to me? And more of, well, God, what are you doing in me through this? How are you going to take this situation and help me become more of a Christ follower through this situation? How are you changing me, even in the midst of what life is happening to me? And so we do get some sort of choice in all of this, and it's the choice to respond. In fact, I would encourage you in this moment, as we sit here on a Sunday morning, to think in your own life, what are examples of times when life has happened to you and you would prefer that some situation did not happen? It was not ideal. It was not how you would have chose it. Maybe it's the example of, oh, I got transferred and I would rather be here, but now I have to be there and figure out a new life. Or maybe it's as simple as, hey, I was with this person and all of a sudden they decided to break up. That wasn't my decision. I would have preferred to be with this person. Now, what does life look like now? There's all sorts of things, and I hope you think of one in your own life where you go, okay, that's not how I would have done it. That's not how I would have planned it. And it's not going to be as extreme as Hagar and Ishmael, but it may be true for you. So think of what is that in your life, and then wonder to yourself, how might God use that to change you, to form you into a different person? It's not ever to say that what life did is right. It doesn't excuse it, but it gives you an opportunity to learn and grow from it. And so I hope that you take this story, this sad, tragic, random story in the first book of the Bible, and I hope you're reminded that even if you feel like you're traveling in the wilderness, that God is still there, that God is in the wilderness with you, and that God's going to use that to shape us and change us and the people that he has been creating us to be. Let's pray.